Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel. My name is Ilyas Velfoul. I am director at WISE, and I'm very proud on behalf of WISE and Qatar Foundation to partner with Holland IQ on the series of summits that are happening across the next 6 months in different cities and remotely. Today, we have 4 great speakers that are gonna share some insights about investment in education and EdTech in Africa. How to attract FDI or investment to support education and EdTech in Africa. That's the title of our panel. To give a little bit of a background, foreign direct investment to African countries hit a record of $83 billion in 2021. Bilateral investment agreements are also mushrooming across the continent. For instance, the Global Gateway Africa aims to support Africa for a strong, inclusive, green, and digital recovery by investing around $150 billion by 2030. According to the EU, member countries will support concrete and transformational projects jointly identified in priority areas. Similarly, just recently in Tunis, Japan has pledged 30 billion of investment in Africa in the next 3 years. Whereas the additional foreign investment pledge opens a windows of opportunities for many in Africa, question remains as to how and to what extent EdTech entrepreneurs will be able to tap into this large capital inflows, especially when it comes to the education sector. Finance gap remain very large. So how, if at all, will the funds be accessible for EdTech founders and investors? Can we single out any best practice in this regard from similar pledges previously made by foreign countries? The panel today will discuss the recent investment trends in Africa and identify potential pathways for EdTech founders to capitalize on these additional funds. Let me introduce you to the 4 panelists. We will give them 20 seconds to give a quick introduction about the work they do, and we will start immediately after with our first question. Shannon May, co-founder and president of New Globe Education. Nathalie Muniampenda, CEO of Kepler. Khaled Ben Jilani, senior partner at Africa Invest, and Andrew McCusker, head of education finance at Opportunity International. I am happy to start with Shannon.
Thank you, Elias. I'm proud to be here. Glad to speak for those of us who are working across the continent trying to support governments to improve education. So let's go.
Nathalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm the CEO of Kepler. Kepler is trying to reinvent higher education and skilling to focus on the transitions out of schooling, particularly around the future of work. And I'm excited to be here to talk about the education and the challenges around that.
Thank you. Khaled.
So my name is Khaled. I work at Africa Invest, where we invest in African companies, both mature companies, but also startups. In all sectors, but specifically in the education sector, and in EdTech through a fund that invests into startups.
Thank you. Andrew.
And hi, I'm Andrew McCusker, the head of the Education Finance Program at Opportunity International. We work to increase funding into various actors along the education value chain in underfunded education systems, including across Africa.
Well, thank you very much. If I may start with a very broad question to 4 of you, and we'll do the same order. We'll start with Shannon, Natalie, Khaled, and Andrew. We see this excitement about investment in Africa. Big announcement from the EU, big announcement recently from Japan, big announcement from the US. There is definitely a geopolitical dimension to this. But if we go to the things that are in the field we're interested in, where do you see the opportunities for entrepreneurs that are trying to do something in education? Is there any way to tap into the flow of money that is coming in Africa from these big pledges? And again, this is not meant to be an expert question. It's more your feeling about this excitement and what are the opportunities for entrepreneurs operating in Africa?
Well, thank you, Elias. I think it is an exciting time, but I would say it's also a shift in a dynamic. If an entrepreneur working in education or specifically EdTech is going to try to position themselves to access this new level of investment. But I think it's exciting because it forces all of us to think through what's the real point of education. Like if we take a step back and we think through why the EU and why Japan made these announcements, they're both very clear that they're trying to look at how to build a relationship that'll be built on trade with Africa. Now, for that to happen, lots of things are going to have to shift. Those of us who work in education, the part we play is how do we prepare the current generation to be a more empowered, more prepared workforce, more empowered and prepared leaders who then can be part of manufacturing jobs, who can create new opportunities. So I think different from a typical investment where you might be looking at, what is this investor looking at? How do I fit in their portfolio? I think specifically for this big move with FDI, all of us in education need to be much more explicit about how does our work translate into employment? How does it improve the GDP of this country? And I think thankfully, there's a lot of evidence that shows on both ends of that spectrum, whether you're in primary school or whether you're working in vocational or skills work or tertiary work, that the single most correlated intervention to increasing GDP and improving the economy is successful improvements of education at a nationwide scale. So if we as entrepreneurs can align ourselves to demonstrating those linkages to improving the economy through improving skills, through improving literacy and numeracy, and positioning ourselves as part of that shift from aid to trade, I think we'll have a better chance at accessing some of that capital, even though I still think it'll be pretty difficult.
Thank you, Shannon. Natalie, I'd love to hear from your perspective about all these promises that are pouring into the continent.
Yes, thank you. I think the big challenge is that the structures, they say 83 billion from the EU package and 50 billion, I think you said, from the Japanese announcement. The challenge is that a lot of the relationship remains bilateral with countries or at least with major institutions. And so whatever funds those go into that support entrepreneurs, it is yet to be seen if we're going to have different mechanisms for entrepreneurs to access those funds. I think that's a big challenge, and I think it's a challenge to governments as well as the EU and other partners to think through how can they make it easier for entrepreneurs, particularly in Africa, where a lot of the challenges are more than just your products. I'll come back to that. The big part is, do you have the infrastructure, whether it's the digital infrastructure? Is it cost effective? What are the other costs that entrepreneurs run into beyond what their idea is, and if there's a market for their idea? So I think thinking at a consortium level with governments bringing in other investors, thinking through all the infrastructure challenges, looking at the skills. And on the skill side, a lot of are left, we can talk about that later, but educators or the skilling part is often left very isolated. And so then they remember the skills part when we have no skills. I used the example recently, I was asked whether we were training our students for green jobs. And I said, what green jobs, right? So no one tells the educators that you need to be adding these skills that are very important coming up. And for entrepreneurs, I always say, you have to think about what is the problem that is needed to be solved. A lot of ideas are great, but is there a market for those ideas at the moment? And what problem are you solving that governments need to make sure that they have you at the table in this consortium kind of model? But on the continent, this is not Europe, this is not Japan. You have to think at all levels: infrastructure, digital infrastructure, policies, regulations, funding, and skilling before you get to a point where an entrepreneur can benefit from whatever funding is available if they have access to that funding.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'll come back to you. I have two questions based on some of the things you just mentioned, but I'll come back to you after this first round. Khaled, you've been operating in the continent for over 27 years, at least Africa Invest, the institution you work with. When you hear these big announcements, what's your reaction? And as a VC, you've also been investing in education recently. Is there any way to take advantage of that? Of those big announcements?
No, first, I think we need to first say that the continent is not just one country, it's 54 countries, and the education landscape is extremely different from one country to another. Every single country has its own advantages and its own weaknesses, and I think whenever an entrepreneur needs to think about their own way to position themselves on the education sector, they need to think what are the strengths that they have in their countries and build on the top of this. I think there are commonalities that are happening on the continent, which is essentially on new needs that are derived through basically the emergence of digital services across all sectors. And so there's a very strong need for digital skills in Africa. I think I've read a study, I think, by IFC that was mentioning about 230 million people have to be trained on digital skills. So that gives you an idea of the size of the opportunity, which has also a very strong growth from a demographic standpoint. So organically, this is an opportunity that will keep growing. Then the specific model depends on the segment and on the countries. But I agree on what Nathalie was saying before. I think there's not only opportunities to actually train people, upskill people, provide curricula that are graduating or not, but there's also issues on finding the educators. One of the very big problems that we face in Africa is that we miss a lot of the education that should help basically build these programs. And a substitute for that would be to come up with innovative models using digital and technologies to make up for that gap.
Right. Thank you, Khaled, and thank you for clarifying that. I've been saying this in many of our sessions that I think it's a mistake to tackle Africa as one place, and we're looking at 54 countries, and it's important to make that clarity. Andrew, I don't know, it's the toughest place you are right now because you heard Shannon, you heard Nathalie, you heard Khaled. What else you can add, based on the observation I started with?
Yeah, probably firstly just to say it's very welcome that we're starting to see more foreign inflows into this underfunded sector. And so we know that following COVID, education systems are underfunded by about $200 billion per year if we're going to hit SDG 4 by 2030. And so we need more funding to come not only from domestic sources in market, but also from foreign investors. And whether they be private investors or public investors, either bilateral or multilaterals, we just need more capital into this underfunded sector. In terms of ways that education actors in the value chain across Sub-Saharan Africa can be accessing this funding, I guess the advice is just to be aware of who is out there, particularly in the international space, that's interested in funding the various types of financing that they may be interested in, for example, debt equity or blended capital. From where we sit, we're seeing inflows from all types of investors, so both the public and private side from foreign. And I guess just being aware of who they are and what they're looking to fund by looking at resources such as the EdTech Hub, for example, is a pretty good way to pinpoint those that may be most interested in investing in particular interventions.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll stay with you, Andrew, with the following question, which can you highlight some strategy that for the audience, at least for the founders audience and entrepreneurs, is there any strategy you could share based on your experience to our audience on how to, and we're not looking only into the FDI, like what are the strategies to get the available investment?
Yeah, I guess just being aware of who is funding similar interventions to what you were hoping to raise funding for. For example, if you just look at your peer organizations and see who the equity investors, debt investors, or even grant and blended capital funders are, that can provide you with a pretty good sense as to where the flow of money is coming from. What we are seeing is more demand for or more investment capital, I guess, looking for homes for good investment ideas. And so funders are receptive to innovative ideas. And as Shannon mentioned early on, particularly those interventions that are breaking down the barriers to education, whether that be the lack of access or the lack of learning outcomes or quality, if you like.
Thank you very much, Khaled. I'd love to come back to you with a question related to. So you've been investing for many years. You're much more involved now in education and EdTech. What are the different channels available right now when it comes to investment, and what kind of entrepreneurs come to see you as well?
So the channels, I think, probably given the amount of money that is being is being planned to be invested on in the education sector in Africa, there's probably going to be new channels that have to be created. I don't see how the current channels can actually be able to distribute that much money. But for now, I think there's two main channels that basically are being used for cooperation and development finance, which is basically banks and any credit institution that can actually outreach to education institution in the private sector, at least. I'm not a specialist of the public sector, unfortunately, but there's probably more actually there. And second, equity funds. So basically, so that basically there is also a need for different strategies in the equity sector, whether on growing current institution in the education sector. And for instance, here there's plenty of opportunities for consolidation and growth. One of the big things that is missing in the continent is that we've seen rarely institution education sector that have been able to scale across countries because of the regulatory hurdles, because of the also the capital intensive nature of the current education institutions in different countries, but also new models. I think there's a lot to be done in the EdTech space. I hope that we will see many funds specialized basically in this sector to help entrepreneurs build the right models and to help them grow. So I think equity funds definitely have a very important role. And then I think something else that is important is that it should be also, there should be some subsidies and grants, because building the adequate programs, making sure that the programs are inclusive, often is expensive, and private actors will probably go to the low-hanging fruits, while there may be some very interesting opportunities from a scale standpoint at the lower of the pyramid. But basically, we need to provide these entrepreneurs an incentive, and these incentives have to come in a form that basically is not a dilutive form at the equity level and not a debt. And so I think smart grants and subsidies could play a very important role to spur new models in the space.
Thank you very much, Khaled. Natalie, I was thinking about what you mentioned, and we know there is a gap, and there is the sector in Africa is underfunded. Can you shed light a little bit on this gap in the education system, and how, if there is a better redistribution, how it could affect the work of entrepreneurs on the ground?
Yes, that's a very complicated question, but let me maybe break it down into three pockets. The first pocket is that a lot of tech or EdTech entrepreneurs, if I come from the perspective of entrepreneurs first, have to figure out their financial model very quickly. And on the continent, you have to figure out your financial model and who's going to pay for this and at the same time deal with access with people who cannot pay. So the people who need this the most cannot pay. And I think that's an opportunity for governments and for bilateral partners and whoever wants to intervene. I think it comes back to what Khaled was saying on grants and other things. The access point, the people who are paying, if you look at the most successful EdTech, particularly coming out of Kenya, these are people who can pay, and they're middle class or already going to private schools. So how do you touch on technology to enhance access? Because the majority of young people on the continent who are the globe's future workforce cannot afford to pay for these EdTech services. So what is the financial model? How do you get there very quickly? That's a question entrepreneurs have to think about. We are a very innovative institution, and our model is that besides our refugee population, young people are taking an ethical loan, so student financing, but we're still subsidizing more than 50% for them to be able to access our degrees as well as our other services. The second point is a lot of EdTech discussions happen, and on the continent particularly, we need what the missing chunk. We have a year foundation program because a lot of the skills that they have to develop in primary and secondary, they don't. And so we have to take a year out to bring up to level all the students who come through our doors at Kepler. And so this foundational area is one that is interesting, but the caveat is a lot of EdTech or companies or even discussions on education skip teachers and almost want to say, hey, we need this instead of teachers, and instead of listening to what teachers are saying or what they need and where you can come into using technology to support them. So, EdTech companies and other things that remove teachers primarily at the secondary, pre-primary, primary, secondary is a mistake. I think that we are not going to get to the goals that we have there. And so listening to the needs of the people in the space around what is needed and how technology can support that. And finally, in terms of government, a lot of the funding, as I said, is for public institutions. I'm a private institution, and the new models that Khaled was talking about, the innovative models, are generally coming from private institutions that have the flexibility to be able to try new things. And they do not have that access to large scales of funding. And I think that these new models and new skills, we have to find pockets and financial models that would work. And a lot of that comes down to thinking through all the stages. What do we need for infrastructure? What do we need for digital infrastructure? What do we need for regulations and policies? What do we need for skilling? And what can entrepreneurs do and how we can support them? That kind of global discussion is missing. Everybody's kind of siloed and they go to different funding partners. And then at the end, you'll come back to a funder and say, I have all this, but then I'm missing the infrastructure, which was like question number one. Do you have the infrastructure to run this technology? I hope I answered your question. I didn't, but I answered it the way that I thought was irrelevant.
No, it was more simple than my complicated question, though it was a great answer, okay? Shannon, there is a lot of entrepreneurs right now. There's a lot of people actually who started doing EdTech recently. So they're going based on an opportunity, right? We see more opportunity in EdTech. You see more founders moving from other sectors, from Fintech to EdTech. So I want to ask you the specific question related to, flipping the coin. Let's say there's a lot of investment out there. What is how a founder merit to get access to those investment? And based on your experience, what's the evidence that make an entrepreneur more appealing than another? And I'd love to hear a little bit about the evidence, a little bit about the M&E and.
Yeah. Well, before I go to evidence and M&E, I'm going to build off something that Natalie said, which is the first place you need to start as an entrepreneur, if you want anyone's support, right? You should only take on an investor, essentially, if you need their capital to help you build out enough of your business to get enough consumer traction that then it supports itself. And to earn that trust from an investor, you have to be able to prove that you have a business model. And I think related to that, you have to prove that you have an intervention or a product or a service that can be used in the market you're trying to serve. So Natalie was touching on that when she's saying, hey, have you really thought about all the other infrastructure pieces you may need to rely on? One thing that I've noticed, particularly during COVID and post-COVID across the continent, is there's a lot of interest in learning at home. Can you sell digital lessons? Can you sell things that a child can access directly at home? The push I would give to entrepreneurs moving into that space and to investors considering it is, what's the total addressable market? In Sub-Saharan Africa, that market's tiny. It's likely not very investable, because the amount of families who have the fiber connection that can run that sort of video, the amount of families who have a laptop that a child can use by themselves, that is, I can't tell you what it is for every country across the continent, but from Kenya and Nigeria, that's going to be less than 10% of the population, probably even less than that if I ran the numbers. In countries like Liberia, it's no one. In countries like Rwanda, it's going to be less than 1%. So from a both entrepreneur and investor thesis, what's your scale? Is the question that everyone should be asking. Like, not only what problem are you trying to solve, but for whom are you solving it? And your price point is going to tell you a lot about what then your scale is going to be, as well as what infrastructure you require. It's New Globe's own orientation. We've thought long and hard about this, and that's why we've always designed to be affordable to both governments and to families living in abject poverty. And it's the push I would give to a lot of entrepreneurs. I think a lot of entrepreneurs go upscale too fast. They start at way too high in the luxury market, and pricing something at a rate that someone who's earning more than $4 per day per family would have to have the money to afford means you've priced yourself out of 95% of the African market. So you need to design for something that's affordable for people who are living on $2 a day. You need to design for something where there is no fiber at home. There is no hardware already in that child's hand. You need to design for where that household or that school may not even have their own electricity connection. Knowing how often are they even going to be recharging a device if your intervention uses a device. And so I think there's, as Natalie was pointing out, when you ignore the ecosystem constraints and you ignore the financial constraints, you're going to end up designing something that really isn't investable and that no one should look at anyway. And you should go back, start over, make a new plan. So like my push would be, design, know what your market's going to be, know what their financial constraints are, understand what your price point's going to be, understand what other infrastructure you rely on, make sure you're designing something that's fit for purpose. Then once you do all of that, make sure it works. Because again, like there's a lot of competition out here. So, and parents, if you're doing a consumer product, if you're trying to get to a large total addressable market, they have very little capital. They're incredibly picky. They're incredibly discerning about what's going to work for them or not. They're only going to use your product if it actually has a demonstrable, visible change, for the learning that they're looking for their child, or if it's a young adult, for what they see changing for themselves. Similar for whether a government's going to purchase it or not. And I'd say that's the other thing that I think often gets left out in these conversations is governments are the biggest purchaser across all 54 of these countries of education services, right? So thinking through how to design for those government primary and secondary schools so that those children don't need the remedial year that Kepler is having to give them, so that they're actually able to, secure the education that would prepare them for life through our government systems, and to not forget that that's actually the biggest buyer on the continent. So those are my pushes.
No, thank you, Shannon. This is a very good clarification on the challenges on the ground and the expectation. We have 4 minutes left. I want to ask a question to Andrew, and then I want to give a chance to the four of you just to give us some final word of wisdom before saying goodbye to the audience. Andrew, you're operating at a global scale, so you've been working in Latin America as much as India. Is there any way you can share some? Okay, what are the learnings from other regions that could apply for the continent?
Yeah, sure. Well, just as every country in Sub-Saharan Africa is different, there's vast differences between the markets. In terms of accessing funding, though, we are seeing like a lot more funding going into markets where there is a lot of growth. And so particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have strong growth in school-age populations, investment capital is following that. And, as Shannon is well aware, parents are pretty discerning as to where they're sending their kids, and more kind of non-state provision of education that we're seeing across Sub-Saharan Africa is meaning that there's more household funding for the sector, as well as interest from foreign investors across the continent. Now, some of those demographic and consumer preference shifts are consistent across all three regions, if you like. However, the growth in the size of the market that we are seeing in Sub-Saharan Africa due to high fertility rates is driving increased demand for education, which I think is pretty attractive to private investors.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, I'd like to respond to Shannon's comments before. Shannon, apologies if I don't agree with you on some of the points, but I think they're very interesting trends. I agree on the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all, and there are countries that have other problems to solve before basically we can provide with innovative ways to provide digital education. However, I think there's been very important trends, that are changing the landscape of how you can distribute and produce innovative digital education in Africa. One of them is mobile. Of course, you don't have computers in Africa, at least in most countries. The penetration is very low. But the penetration of smartphone, at least a mobile phone that have an internet connection, whether it's a smartphone or a smart-enabled phone, I think it has come up from 4% 10 years ago to over 64% in a matter of only 10 years. This is quite a move, actually. And plus, you have several trends that have happened in the meantime, not only in Africa, around big data, around AI, that are basically providing new opportunities. And all of these technologies today, whether in Africa or globally, are becoming readily available without having to have like the global specialist in this sector. And so there are models today that are enabled by this trend. And I think we should look at what is possible versus what is not possible. And what is possible today, I think, in a complementary way to what schools or traditional schools are doing, is tutoring. Tutoring today, and there are several startups that are doing this by video, is possible. The cost of accessing internet, the cost of the bandwidth is coming down tremendously. It's been divided by over 10 over that same period of time, of 10 years. And so most population can have usually today have access to this sorry, Shannon on the left. I hope it's not against me. To these innovative educational services. Another one is basically upskilling for digital skills, and that provides for another opportunity, which is basically hybrid products between fintech and edtech. So if you come with a smart fintech product that can actually fund those education through loans or through other kind of financial products, using basically AI as a way to score these people and evaluating their ability to improve their earnings through this education, I think you could also. This is not science fiction, but this is happening in countries like Nigeria, like Ghana today, as partnership between fintech and edtech. So at least I have the hope that innovation can solve part of the equation, not all, agreed, but part of it at least.
You know, I need to make a recommendation to Patrick and Maria to increase the time next time, because the fun start at 30 minutes. This is where the debate, and this is where we want to see, we want to see the exchanges. So look, just to be fair, I need to give at least 30 seconds for Shannon to reply to you, and then 20-second wisdom words from Natalie and Andrew, and we have to bring this panel to an end.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, how did I know what you're disagreeing with me about? Like, I've been working in innovation on the continent for 15 years. I deeply believe in innovation as a solution to all sorts of problems. The push is when people design something that's not fit for purpose, and that's happening all the time, right? So the push is how to design what's fit for purpose, whether it's for in the hands of that teacher who there's no electricity at the school. That's a real situation in the majority of public schools across the continent. So if you don't admit that and you don't know that, you're not going to design the right EdTech product that will actually serve her. If you don't know what devices a household has access to and how those devices are controlled, then you don't know how to create, whether you need USSD or whether you could leverage WhatsApp, and how you're going to create that access for the child, unless you know all of that. So my push is to entrepreneurs is do your homework, like be here, live this life, understand your customer, or else you're going to design something that isn't fit for purpose. But there's an incredible amount of innovation that's possible and that's needed so that more children are learning across the continent. But, as Elise was pushing, giving me the opportunity to say, if it doesn't work, it will fail eventually. Like if it doesn't change the learning impact for the child, it'll stop being purchased, it'll stop being acquired, the funder will stop funding it, your market falls apart, right? So that's like a lot of entrepreneurs think about whether it works too late in the game. And so my push is to start thinking about that early, start thinking about do I actually impact learning as part of your design thesis rather than waiting too late?
Thank you, Shannon and Khaled. Andrew, quick 20-second word of wisdom, and we will finish with Natalie, please.
Perhaps no wisdom, just an observation that delighted to see more investment capital flowing into this much needed sector. If anyone on the call has or would like any ideas about some potential ways to invest capital within the continent, please do reach out to me.
Thank you.
Great. So just coming back to a couple of very important points, and I hope I'm going to do this in 20 seconds. I think I want to mention the role of telcos and ISPs, as Khaled was talking about. There's a role there that they can play to be brought into the discussion early on, particularly around pricing and what they can do if we're teaching on mobile. A lot of the time, governments will listen to entrepreneurs and their challenges if they come in a group, in a consortium, in an organized way with very specific ways that the government can assist. And I would say that the role of this FDI funding should include a lot of the infrastructure challenges that we exist. I agree with Shannon that in our space, we give every student a laptop because they do not have a laptop. And we run online education, an online degree. How are you going to do that if you don't have the basic infrastructure? And during COVID, when our students had to go back home, some of them to a refugee camp, we had to organize with UNHCR for them to come and plug for an hour. So I think those are some of the realities that exist on the ground. But I do believe that there are so many opportunities. And the way that I view it, at least that's the way that we've structured, we start off giving full scholarships. Eventually, we brought in a business model where they're paying. But then we thought about, okay, if they're going to pay back when they're working, we need to get them a job. So you always have to be thinking, what is the next part of the ecosystem before you and after you for these things to work? Particularly thinking, as he was saying, fintech and edtech that, that would fund these devices or the infrastructure needs that you have, and would be in a way that would work with your business model so people can pay back. And I would end by saying there's a huge opportunity with upskilling through employers who are willing to buy technology and figure out a way internally with their financial model, how they retain employees by upskilling them and coming into new markets. So I would say that entrepreneurs on the continent, unfortunately, always have to think of what happens before me and what happens after me and how this works with my business model. But I would say there are very many challenges, but there's a lot of opportunities. Patient capital is a word that's thrown out a lot, but I think that on the continent, some of this FDI funding needs to come into that part to help some of the scaling and business models. And let's think about a consortium level. I just find that a lot of times each one of us works in a silo, and on the skilling perspective, we're only brought to say, hey, give us some skills. And then you're like, I need 5 years for the accreditor to allow me to give these skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. This is a great way to bring to an end our panel. Once again, this was, I think, insightful, and I think we could have done another half an hour easily. I will definitely recommend to the summit organizer that next time we have a longer conversation. So thank you for your time, and I believe if anyone from the participant would want to reach you, they could find you on LinkedIn or other channels. And I think the future is bright in Africa, and based on the work you do, things are going to change fast. And I want to thank you for that. So we stay in touch, and we thank the audience for their participation.
Thank you, yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.